Today I'm going to talk about the trends that are advancing the energy transition from fossil fuels to clean energy sources. These trends are technological, they are economic, they are policy-based, they are environmental, they are social. So I'm going to just touch upon a few of these trends, but as you can see, there are many, many forces driving the energy transition. And what is important about all these things, which I won't discuss because I only have 30 minutes, is that none of these phenomena are static. These are all trends that are accelerating. They're growing stronger in their influence. And what is also important is the synergy between some of these trends. And that's what I'll try to do is, to the extent that I cover a handful of these, I want to sort of contextualize the discussion of the energy transition by showing the relationship between some of these trends. So, advanced energy technology and innovation. Today, wind energy and solar energy is the cheapest electric generation source in 90% of the world. The cost of solar technology has been, the all-in cost of utility scale solar has been reduced by more than 80% in the last decade. And we are harboring the ambition of further cuts, particularly in the manufacture of solar cells, because the first manufacturing plants for perovskite solar cells are just being constructed. These solar cells are cheaper. The materials used to produce them are more environmentally benign, and they lend themselves to more efficient manufacturing processes. So we can look forward to solar being potentially, the cost of solar being, at least the module manufacturing, being cut in half or more. Okay, so 2 weeks ago, Marty Lagina took down the 600 kilowatt turbine on M72. This is one of the latest offshore turbines that have been developed, the General Electric Heliade X13. It's actually rated at 14 megawatts now. Larger turbines are coming to the market very quickly from companies called Vestas and Gamesa. But this single turbine can power 20,000 European households or 10,000 US households. Europeans consume approximately, on average, 1/2 the electricity American households do. So this illustrates the levelized cost of energy of the various generation sources. Lazard is a consultancy that produces this report and updates it every year. So what is the levelized cost of energy? The levelized cost of energy is the net per unit cost of energy. This sounds a little complicated, but it's really not. The unit cost of energy over the lifetime, the operational lifetime of the generation asset, the electric coal plant or natural gas plant, that sort of thing. Taking into account all the costs, the capital investment, operation and maintenance costs, fuel costs, financing, etc. So you see that wind and solar is the most economical. This is the latest levelized cost chart from Lazard. This is an unsubsidized analysis. Renewable energy has the benefit of something called the investment tax credit, but without that credit, you can see that utility scale solar and wind is the least expensive energy option available. So how cheap is solar? In those areas of the world that get a lot of sunshine, these utility scale projects, and they're large, 600 megawatts, 1,500 megawatts. This is a smaller project, but these are large projects. The cost under 15 and 20-year contracts are, a penny a kilowatt hour. You're paying from consumers 15 or 16 cents a kilowatt hour. At Cherryland, it's 12, Tony? 12? Yeah, so the amazing thing about this, if you add storage capacity, which gives you 4 to 8 hours of storage, you're only adding a couple of cents to the contractual cost of solar. To put this in the further context, how does this compare to nuclear as a new option? Well, there were in the last decade 4 nuclear plants under construction, 2 in South Carolina at a place called VC Summer. They spent $9 billion on that plant before they gave up on it, so it's no longer under construction. The only 2 units currently under construction are the Vogtle units in Georgia, and those were to come online in 2015 at a cost of $13 billion. The first unit is scheduled to come online next year, and the cost of the project presently exceeds $30 billion. So here's the point. It's uncertain what the cost of electricity from those facilities will be, but it probably is going to be in the neighborhood of 20 to 30 cents per kilowatt hour. I am not anti-nuclear. The problem with nuclear energy is just that it can't compete economically, at least not presently. So the consequence of renewable energy being so cheap is that that's what's being added to the grid. So 74% of all new electric generation capacity added in 2022, and this is by data from the Energy Information Administration, 74% is wind, solar, and batteries. In the last several years, it's been more than that. It's been more than 80% has been wind and solar alone. There's a pulse of natural gas expected to be coming by the EIA this year. So the new capacity added is largely zero carbon technologies. At the same time, we have the forecast for electric generation capacity that will be retired, and that is almost all fossil fuel retirements. So over time, every year, the national grid gets cleaner because more renewable energy sources, zero carbon sources, are added to the grid, and more fossil fuel sources are being retired. That allows utilities to announce publicly dramatic cuts in carbon emissions. The nation's largest utilities, you can see DTE Energy has a target of net zero on the bottom here by 2050. Consumers Energy, their goal is net zero by 2040. Here you see the renewable energy uptake in terms of percentages, the green line. This generally shows how much farther we have to go to if we have the ambition of replacing electric generation resources with renewable energy, because we're actually in 2021, at the end of 2021, 19.5% of the electricity generated in the country was from wind, solar, and hydro. So another of these forces driving us to a clean energy future is policy. So there are 20 states that either by administrative order or by law, by passing statutes, have 100% clean energy or renewable energy goals. So what I want to talk about for a couple of minutes is the response of the business community and corporations to clean energy opportunities. So the largest, most dynamic companies in the world are all committed to zero carbon power sources. Microsoft last year, interestingly enough, indicated that zero carbon electricity sources would not only power all of their global operations, they will go farther and supplant or purchase renewable energy at a level that displaces all the carbon emissions since the company began, since its inception in 1975. So this is a chart illustrating the rise in corporate purchases of renewable energy. In 2021, slightly more than 31,000 megawatts of wind and solar energy were purchased. And the top corporate buyers of clean energy: Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook, now Meta, third. So this is something we were just discussing at our table. This is a corporate adoption of environmental, social, and governance principles. 90% of publicly traded corporations have embraced these principles publicly. But as you can see, these things are really pretty complex. And arguably, some of these are not in perfect alignment with the fiduciary duties to shareholders. You can argue that both ways. But these are complex to integrate into a corporate culture. And to operationalize all of these things into a corporation is very, very challenging, particularly in the absence of authoritative guidance or rules or regulations that prescribe standards. However, that's Bridget, my wife, by the way. That's right. But a new rule by the Security and Exchange Commission probably coming down Monday, a proposed rule coming down Monday, will require publicly traded corporations to quantify and disclose the amount of carbon emissions that their operations produce. But it's likely going to require Scope 3. So let me briefly explain this. Scope 1 is direct emissions from the operations of a corporation. Scope 2 includes Scope 1, but also includes emissions from the power sources that the corporation uses. Scope 3 includes Scope 1 and Scope 2, but includes all upstream and downstream emissions. So what is that? So the upstream emissions are the commodities, the materials, the equipment that is manufactured to be used by the corporation. The downstream emissions are emissions associated with the products that they produce. So this is really pretty complex. And like I said, we are going to have that rule certainly in the next month, but what I've read this morning, actually, that it's expected to come down Monday. So the public is overwhelmingly in favor of renewable energy, wind and solar. There are many polls that illustrate this, and importantly, it bridges the partisan divide, right? Our politics are so polarized, but this is something that we can agree on. Parenthetically, remarkably, Jeff, you mentioned flow, and thank you for the donation, but another area of partisan agreement is concern over water in the Great Lakes in our region and maintaining the quality of that water, and that's what flow is dedicated to. But at any rate, this is really important because the public supports wind and solar energy unless and until the project's proximate to their community, which is one of the many challenges that we have. So this may be in the future the most important forcing function propelling the energy transition forward, because we need the global financial community to essentially be all in on this. And that is beginning. The financial institutions are beginning to restrict lending. Their pronouncements are greater than their actual performance, but it is beginning to happen, and it's being led by some of the largest institutions in the world. So this is the CEO, Larry Fink, from BlackRock, the largest investment firm in the world. Awareness is rapidly changing, and I believe we are on the edge of a fundamental reshaping of finance. The evidence on climate risk is compelling investors to reassess core assumptions about modern finance. In the near future, and sooner than most anticipate, there will be a significant relocation of capital, which is happening. For the very first time in 2021, more capital flowed to renewable energy projects than fossil fuel projects. But that amount there you see in 21 really needs to double, and double soon, as I'll try to explain why. So this is really happening actually more aggressively in the insurance and reinsurance markets, where these companies have announced that in the future or presently they will no longer finance coal mines, coal plants, or pipeline companies that transport oil and gas. So divestment. Divestment is occurring. It's a phenomenon. The University of Michigan, my alma mater, my kids' alma mater, announced their intention to divest last year. A particular challenge here is when these institutions and companies divest, and funds divest, they divest to others who may not be so inclined to embrace ESG principles. These investments go somewhere, right? Hedge funds. So electrifying transportation, something really interesting, really important, and a very strong driver. So 29% of carbon emissions in the United States are attributable to transportation. 58% of that 29% are light-duty vehicles, cars, light-duty trucks, and SUVs. So all of the global OEMs are transitioning to electric drivetrains, and they're doing it very aggressively on very short timelines. Toyota is sort of an asterisk. They're signaling some ambiguity. But the deal is, it's hard for our existing OEMs, Ford and Chevrolet, to make this transition. They still have to support internal combustion gasoline and diesel vehicles for some time in the future, while making this transition to electric vehicles. So the startups, the pure EV plays like Tesla and Xpeng and NIO in China, they have something of an advantage. So in terms of policy, California and Massachusetts have passed laws prohibiting the sale of new light-duty vehicles by 2035. 10 states are likely to follow probably this year. That these are the 10 states that endorsed or adopted California CAFE standards for vehicles in the past. The 27 countries that comprise the European Union, they are on the cusp of also passing legislation that would prohibit the sale of gasoline-powered vehicles by 2035. Metropolitan areas around the world are going to create exclusionary zones. They've announced their intention. So there are various prognosticators, consultancies, energy companies, oil and gas companies that are trying to predict EV uptake and what that will do to oil demand. This is sort of a mid-range estimate. So, and this is a mid-range estimate as well. This is from Deloitte. This is a graph that illustrates electric vehicle penetration. This top line is the European market, and then China, and then this yellow line represents the combination of all of these. This is the U.S. lagging behind a bit. There are forecasts that are much more aggressive than this. There are forecasts that are slower than this, but it really looks like EVs are beginning to do what is called the technology S-curve. And that's where a new technology is introduced to the market. You can, I hope you can read this, but the penetration begins, with cell phones very slowly, then immediately goes up very fast until you have essentially full penetration. So here's something a little complex, but I didn't want to pass over it. The International Monetary Fund in September 21 issued its third report on worldwide subsidies for fossil fuels. And this report indicates, and it's a fairly long and detailed report, that the total, in 2020, the total subsidies for fossil fuels globally were $5.8 trillion. 600 billion were direct subsidies from countries to defer or in part the cost of petroleum to its population. But 5.2 trillion are what are called negative externalities. That's the health and environmental impacts of fossil fuels and the damage and impairment done to ecological systems that produce benefits. So this is the IMF recommendations. There should be a termination, and the IMF is comprised, manages the economies and makes recommendations for 190 countries worldwide, right? Termination of direct subsidies for fossil fuels, imposition of corrective taxes in amount equal to the damage caused by negative externalities. So negative externalities, again, if you subscribe to Paul Krugman on the left and the Milton Friedman School on the right, the one thing about negative externalities is that basically all economists agree that if you're producing a thing, a commodity, the price should reflect the full cost associated with that. If you don't do that, you have a market failure. So that's sort of the basis of the IFM recommendation and the thinking of economists on that. And they recommend a rapid transition to clean energy. If you do, there's an enormous payoff. For every dollar spent, this is a calculation by IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency. A couple of years ago, the International Energy Agency, the IEA, different than this, but the global equivalent of our information source, which is the Energy Information Administration, they did a report indicating that if we transition incrementally off of fossil fuels through 2050, that the net savings on avoided fuel costs alone would be $71 trillion. So what we can say categorically is that the transition to clean energy is disinflationary. The United States spends 5.7% of GDP on energy expenditures. Globally, it's 3.2%. But if we make this transition, we half the amount of money that we spend on energy. So what you will hear, what will become a meme, what pundits will be calling for in the near future, it's already beginning to happen, but you're not hearing a lot about it, is that we need essentially to electrify everything. And if we do, we dramatically reduce energy demand. Why? Because electric motors, high efficiency electric motors, are so energy efficient. Electric vehicles, the electric motors are 95% efficient. The internal combustion engines are 20 to 30% efficient, so there's a huge savings there. And if we electrify the economy, heat and cooling and everything else, the global potential to reduce energy demand is 57%. If we do clean energy, we reduce health costs, which are really substantial. We mitigate environmental impacts. We enable the robust demand response implementations. This gets a little complicated. Tony knows all about this, but utilities, in cooperation with some of their industrial and commercial companies, can modulate energy demand. We've never been able to do that before, historically, but we can do that now. There's a certain elasticity to energy demand that technology is going to enable, and that will become to residential homes through smart meters, through smart appliances. If you choose, you'll be able to work out or have an arrangement with your energy provider that would allow them to slightly deviate your load now and then in order to help them balance demand with supply. So that's coming. The challenges here are much. Industrial processes are in energy intensive, and so they require a lot of power, a lot of focused power, long distance freight vehicles, shipping vessel, aviation. One of the biggest challenges is seasonal storage. In the winter in northern climates, if we're going to electrify everything, there's going to be a lot of energy needed, and wind and solar are intermittent, and batteries can provide some support, but not long support. I'm assuming most of you guys know Marty Lagina from his various activities, but if you were to ask him how to solve this, he has a ready answer for you, and that is hydrogen. And Katrina Fritz is here and heavily involved with hydrogen fuel cells. She probably concurs, at least to a certain extent, with Marty. But yeah, so if we put all this wind and solar online, it's intermittent. It's going to produce a lot of power at times. Today, particularly in Europe, some of that power is curtailed. It is wasted. If it's redirected to electrolysis to produce what is called green hydrogen, then that hydrogen can be a emission-free fuel to power these other sources here. So the last forcing function, that driver for the energy transition that I want to talk about, is climate and the formidable challenges that we faced. This will just be a couple of minutes. I don't know if I'm going over in time. So this looks complicated. Let me explain it. Climate science has given us a carbon budget. The world in 2021 produced 37 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions, anthropogenic, human-created emissions, and in 2022, we're going to be around the same amount, 37 billion tons that we're going to add. If we want to avoid the most catastrophic impacts of climate change and keep global temperatures rising no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius, and if we want a 50% chance of success in doing that, we can only add 540 billion tons of anthropogenic carbon to the atmosphere. If we want a better chance at doing that, a 67% chance, we can only add 380 tons, about 10 years of global carbon emissions to the atmosphere. If our targets are higher, then we have more latitude. Well, here are some of the challenges, right? This is cumulative emissions of CO2, and 30% of all emissions since the Industrial Revolution has occurred in the last 20 years. This is what we're on. And so the climate scientists are telling us that we don't have the luxury of a easy flight pattern here off of fossil fuels. What we really have to do is that. And can that be done? So to do that means you strand carbon assets. And the difficulty in doing that, is sort of obvious. The oil and gas companies, global oil and gas companies, are Chevrons, BPs, ExxonMobil's, Mobil's. Their proven and probable reserves are the basis of their valuation. So this is existential to them. This is life or death for oil and gas companies. If we're asking them to keep the oil and gas in the ground, the estimate of the value of their proven and probable reserves are $15 trillion. So beyond that, we have countries, we have the Middle East, we have Russia, we have Venezuela, we have Nigeria, whose economies are dependent on the sale of oil and gas. So, how do we deal with that? Actually, there are some ideas on how we deal with that, but I'm out of time and can't tell you about it. But I'll leave you with my favorite cartoon. So thank you. Yeah, sure.
Thanks, Skip. Does anybody have questions?
Your presentation shows that the green people have been busy, without a doubt. I guess I'd classify myself as one of many choices. But in thinking about that, I look at our most recent history. A year or so ago, our president greatly reduced by 1.5 million barrels or so of oil a day the input capable for the United States. That, in my judgment, has led to a level of inflation which we're now suffering and will continue to suffer in the numbers of maybe 10, 12, 15% before it can be abated unless directions change. Secondly, and probably not so readily forecasted at the time he made these decisions, was the possibility that some of our adversaries would take advantage of our lack of capability and Europe's capability, namely Russia, and start a war. My question is to the Green people, how convinced are you really in following your policy if it leads to destruction of our economic society and war as we're seeing in the Ukraine today?
Just one data response is that I believe we are producing more oil and gas in the United States today than in any time in our history. But we certainly could produce more. Second response is that oil as a commodity has a global price. Whatever we do in this country is just an influencer in terms of the international market for oil and gas, the price of which is set globally. But most importantly, what the economic analyses, and there are many, there are actually hundreds now done by our national laboratories, by universities, by the oil and gas companies themselves, they overwhelmingly demonstrate that the transition to clean energy, as I said before, is disinflationary, is a benefit for the economy, and saves money. Why? Because energy is much cheaper that way. It is. It's demonstrably cheaper.
Not in the short term.
So the crisis that we have, I mean, both with COVID and what is happening in the Ukraine, absolutely. It is a big, bomb thrown in all of these projections and analysis. I mean, it really is. And it's certainly going to set things back. And it makes it, again, more complex than it already is. Absolutely agree with you.
With China and India not looking to change their ways and still promoting much of the issues that we have with the climate, even with all the changes that we are trying to implement in the United States, how are we looking to see greater change if these larger countries are not implementing those same changes?
Yeah, so that's sort of the fundamental question, and as I tried to show, and this was just a glimpse of the complexity in the last couple of slides, is that the challenge to actually make this transition in a reasonable time that comports with what the climate science is telling us makes it very difficult. But with respect to China, China by far has the largest penetration of wind and solar energy, far more than the United States, more than twice as much on an annual basis than I have slides on this. I can't give you a precise number. But China is also, because their economy was growing so rapidly, at least until recently, building a lot of power plants, doing that on a regional basis. You can argue that the new power plants, coal-based power plants, are more efficient in operation than the ones that they are retiring. There are a lot of stranded assets in China, including green assets, wind and solar projects that have been built, but for lack of transmission and connectivity are not either standing idle or not performing. So there's a lot of challenges. India has made a public commitment and a public goal to solarize their society, but it's not going to happen. There isn't evidence for that happening on a realistic timeline, presently. Things have to change. So you're right in pointing this out. How do we do this in unison? It's going to be very difficult, but I will say that China and India at least recognize the data. They know, what is the cheapest energy source. And I should say this too, for those populations, approximately 1 billion people of our 7.6 billion people in the world have no electricity service at all. And then there's another several hundred million that have substandard, intermittent access to electricity. 90% of their need and this is pretty reliable. People have looked at this. 90% of their future need, and they have to have electricity, right? It's their only hope of betterment of their condition, is going to be clean energy because it's distributed. They will not build wires and poles and distribution systems. So.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up on that, and thank you for your response. My other question with that is that as we are implementing these changes here in the United States, as you said very aggressively with EVs and getting rid of internal combustion engines, a lot of folks are seeing the pain with that because obviously the costs are still very high for these. Do you think that sometimes maybe we're being a little too aggressive if we're not going to reach the global goals that we're really trying to, and it's causing more economic pain on the average American?
I would be in the other camp. That to the extent, social equity has to be a primary concern. I'm not convinced that we can't make the transition without also supporting low-income access to clean energy sources, better transportation system. We're not going to be buying expensive EVs for poor people. That's not on the horizon, but we can make adjustments to the transportation system, which we should, to alleviate other problems, congestion, high consumption of fossil fuels, that will be of at least some marginal benefit to poorer populations. But the issues that you are raising are, like all of this, what I presented to you is very simplistic, okay? These are really complex problems. They really are.
Energy is not the only thing we're talking about, though. Where do you get the pair of glasses at a reasonable price? Oil is in glasses, in the tires that the cars move with tens of the medicine that we all take around here requires oil. Oil is a product like any other that the more you make of it, the better off you are, price per barrel. The company that makes 2 million cars can sell them cheaper than somebody that makes 200,000 cars. Secondly, if this program was so great, why do we have government control of it? You just told us that states are banning things. What the hell are states banning things for? So they can say that everybody loves it. We need, if you're going to ask me what I want, make what I want. Don't tell me what I have to have.
Well said. Responding to your first observation, a question back to you. What happens if we burn less oil and the oil produced flows to product manufacture? Because you're quite correct. Oil and gas are part of a huge number of things that we use on a daily basis. But what happens to that cost if there's more supply?
Price goes down.
Okay. That's my point.
I was wondering, when you were talking about how Massachusetts and California were going to ban the internal combustion engines, and you were talking about how politicians, everybody's for it, but I guess then they don't want it in their backyard, and there's, they have a lot of donations tied to that. Do you think there's going to be some sort of chasm between, having a lot of people on green energy, but the cost of the initial investments in solar and wind, and then inability to build it? Is there going to come a point where we don't have the infrastructure ready in time, so it's going to turn to a bigger reliance on coal in places like California and stuff initially, because we don't have the infrastructure to power all of that electric reliance? So
that's a very, very good question. So in the in the $1.5 trillion package that has passed the American Relief Act, or what is it called? The American, yeah. There isn't really a line item for renewable energy, but there is $65 billion in a line item for improved transmission. So what you've just identified is certainly an issue, having a transmission and distribution system that connects all this in the most efficient way. The other thing is we have regional, what are called independent system operators. We're part of MISO, a big region of states and provinces called the Midwest Independent System Operation, which controls wholesale prices and connectivity through transmission through all of these states. Well, what is happening now is a real focus on connecting these various independent system operators. It's a project called SEAMS to have better connectivity in doing that. If we do that, then we optimize the use of the renewable energy or all energy sources that we have, whether they're fossil fuel based or renewable. But yeah, improved distribution and transmission, absolutely critical. One more question.
I'm an accountant, so I kind of looked at the cost. You talked about the 1 cent per kilowatt, 2 cent per kilowatt, and that's really staggering compared to you said 12 cents at Cherryland or whatever like that. When you think about the 1 cent, is that, so if you need to also build a natural gas power plant to make the solar and wind reliable throughout the day, is it really truly 1 cent per kilowatt hour?
I'm so glad you asked that question because this is the biggest myth and incorrect assumption in this whole energy debate. The existing electrical energy system, our distribution and transmission system, is one giant battery. When a nuclear plant that has a high capacity, 1,000 megawatts, flips off because something happened, or a coal plant is down for operation and maintenance, or a nuclear plant needs to be refueled, we have the capacity, the surplus capacity to fulfill that need. That's why the interconnected grid is so important. The grid system that we have is the gigantic battery. And so the assertion that when you build a utility scale wind project or solar project that you need discrete backup capacity in case or when that system is intermittent, when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing, is just a fallacy. Thank you.